Part 1. Prologue. The Concealed Truth. The face staring back at you from the wrinkled $20 bill in your hand is that of a man history has feverishly polished into myth. Andrew Jackson, the champion of democracy, the self-made frontiersman, the victor of New Orleans. But etched into the grooves of that engraving lies a far darker truth, one that curls like gunpowder smoke over the blood-stained pages of America's founding. Why does a nation that claims to value liberty immortalize a president who orchestrated the systematic erasure of entire civilizations? The answer lies not in the ink on currency, but in the shadows of a story you were never meant to hear in full. This is not merely a tale of Andrew Jackson. This is the silenced epic of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations peoples who cultivated art, law, and spirituality in these lands millennia before the first colonist carved his initials into a stolen tree. Their vibrant societies, anchored in sacred kinship with the earth, collided catastrophically with an expanding empire that viewed land as ledger entries and human beings as obstacles. The Trail of Tears, that deceptively poetic phrase taught in sanitized schoolhouse paragraphs, was no single trail. It was a sprawling network of suffering. 16,000 Cherokee dragged from ancestral homes at bayonet point. Choctaw children suffocating in frozen mud on an 800-mile death march. Seminole warriors waging a decade-long guerrilla war in Florida swamps rather than surrender their birthright. Consider the cruel irony. Jackson's face now circulates through the same economy that fueled this genocide. His Indian Removal Act of 1830, billed as a voluntary exchange of land, became the legal blueprint for ethnic cleansing, masquerading as progress. But behind the bureaucratic language lay concentration camps where dysentery-ridden elders clutched dying infants, and routes west, littered with unmarked graves. As you watch this film, you'll walk the unmarked trails where children's moccasins wore grooves into stone. You'll meet leaders like Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross. But to reduce these nations to victims would be to perpetuate the colonizer's lie. The Trail of Tears is equally a chronicle of transcendent resilience. While Jackson's soldiers shattered communities, the Cherokee Nation rebuilt its government in exile, preserving their syllabic writing system under threat of cultural annihilation. The Muskogee Creek, stripped of Alabama's fertile plains, secretly carried seeds of their ancestral corn to plant in alien Oklahoma soil. Even in the death marches, mothers whispered origin stories to children, weaving resistance into memory. These were not passive casualties of history, but architects of survival whose legacies pulse through modern movements for indigenous sovereignty. America's conscience has yet to fully confront this open wound. The $20 bill's ghostly imprint of Jackson isn't just an oversight, it's a monument to forgetting. But memory has a way of rising like undammed rivers. As you watch this film, you'll walk the unmarked trails where children's moccasins wore grooves into stone. You'll meet leaders like Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross, who fought removal through U.S. courts while grieving his wife's death in a detention camp. You'll witness the spiritual fire that kept the Seminole defiant in the Everglades' embrace. And you'll confront a question that still haunts this nation. Can a country built on stolen land ever truly heal without truth? The answers lie in the voices the textbooks erased. Let them speak now. Part 2. The Native World Before European Invasion. Long before the sails of European ships pierced the horizons of the Americas, the southeastern woodlands and river valleys thrived with civilizations whose complexity rivaled those across the Atlantic. Here, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations wove intricate tapestries of culture, innovation, and spirituality societies built not on dominion over the land, but kinship with it. To understand the cataclysm that would follow, we must first step into the luminous world. These peoples nurtured for millennia. The Cherokee, known as Anianwea, the principal people, had forged a society as sophisticated as any in the Old World. By the 15th century, their towns dotted the fertile valleys of the southern Appalachians, connected by a web of trade routes that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Each town functioned as a microcosm of democracy. Decisions were made by consensus in council houses, where women held profound influence as clan leaders and custodians of kinship ties. The Cherokee believed in duality, the sacred law of balance, governing not just human interactions, but humanity's relationship with nature. Forests were tended like gardens, cleared intentionally to foster chestnut groves and berry patches. While rivers flowed unpolluted, their fish stocks managed through seasonal rituals, honoring the water spirits. Agriculture was an act of reverence. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, were cultivated together in mounds, their symbiotic growth a lesson in reciprocity. Cherokee farmers spoke to these plants as living relatives, chanting prayers during harvests to thank Selu, the corn mother. Their calendars revolved around lunar cycles and celestial events, with ceremonies like the Green Corn Festival marking the annual renewal of life. Medicine men, or Didonvoiski, memorized thousands of herbal remedies, their knowledge passed down through poetic chants, containing clues to treatments for ailments. Europeans would later label incurable, but perhaps the most revolutionary achievement arose in 1821, when a disabled silversmith named Sequoyah gifted his people a tangible soul, the Cherokee syllabary. Illiterate himself, Sequoyah spent 12 years obsessively studying the talking leaves of European books, determined to preserve Cherokee stories in a form no fire could destroy. His 85-character system, each symbol representing a syllable, was so intuitive that within months, thousands became literate. Suddenly, the Cherokee Nation could print its own newspapers, codify its laws, and send letters across mountains. The Cherokee Phoenix, launched in 1828, became the first Native American newspaper, its pages filled with debates on sovereignty, poetry, and translations of Shakespeare. This was no primitive culture. It was a civilization in full dialogue with the modern world. To the west, the Choctaw governed the lush Mississippi Basin through a tripartite system of peace chiefs, war leaders, and matriarchal lineages. Their long towns stretched for miles, centered around colossal earthen mounds, where ancestors were buried beneath layers of sacred soil. The Creek Confederacy, a coalition of Muskogee-speaking towns, developed a legal code so precise it inspired the U.S. Constitution's separation of powers, yet theirs barred hereditary rule, requiring leaders to earn authority through wisdom and generosity. Even the Seminole, often mislabeled as mere refugees from other tribes, were architects of a radical experiment in freedom. By integrating escaped enslaved Africans into their society, they created a multicultural resistance movement that would later defy the U.S. Army for decades. At the heart of all these nations pulsed a philosophy foreign to European minds. Land was not property, but personhood. Rivers were grandfathers, mountains elders, forests a chorus of living voices. To own land was as absurd as owning air. Instead, humans entered into covenants with the earth, symbolized by rituals like the Choctaw's busk ceremony, where every fire in the nation was extinguished and relit from a central sacred flame. Boundaries were marked not by fences, but by stories of rock formation here. A thunder-struck oak, they're each imbued with teachings for future generations. This harmony, however, masked a gathering storm. As early as 1540, Hernando de Soto's expedition had sliced through the southeast, leaving trails of smallpox and terror. But it was the founding of the United States that transformed distant thunder into a hurricane. European settlers, steeped in Enlightenment-era dreams of domination, saw wilderness where native nations saw kinship. The Cherokees' forests of chestnut and hickory became timber, their ancestral mounds. potential railroad embankments. And deep beneath the red Georgia clay lay the spark that would ignite annihilation: gold. By 1828, the Cherokee Nation's very success sealed its fate. Their constitutional government, their newspapers, their thriving plantations all proved intolerable to a young America hungry for mythologies of racial superiority. The stage was set for a clash of worlds, one rooted in the wisdom of interconnectedness, the other in the cult of conquest. The Trail of Tears did not begin with Andrew Jackson's pen. It began here, in the collision between a people who saw land as a relative and a nation that saw it as a commodity. Part 3. The Rise of American Colonialism. When George Washington assumed the presidency in 1789, he inherited not only a fledgling nation, but a moral contradiction that would stain its founding: a republic born of liberty, yet nourished by theft and violence. In his first address to Congress, Washington framed the Indian problem not as a question of justice, but of logistics: how to neutralize autonomous native nations, whose sovereignty blocked the young country's insatiable hunger for land. The solution, he declared, lay in civilization or eradication, a chilling duality that masked genocide beneath the velvet rhetoric of reform. Thus began America's first systematic campaign of cultural erasure, a war waged not with muskets alone, but with schoolbooks, laws, and the calculated dismantling of a people's soul. The Civilization Fund Act of 1819 became the blueprint for this psychological conquest. Federal funds flowed to missionary groups like the Moravians and Quakers, who established schools of salvation in Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek territories. Native children, as young as 4, were torn from families, their hair sheared, their buckskin clothing burned. At schools like the Brainerd Mission in Tennessee, students faced thrashings for uttering their mother tongues. They memorized psalms in English, while missionaries plundered nearby villages, seizing ancestral burial grounds for church construction. The goal was explicit: to kill the Indian, save the man, as later phrased by Colonel Richard Pratt, architect of the Carlisle Indian School. Survivors recounted classrooms adorned with skulls labeled "vanishing race," a grotesque prophecy. These institutions worked tirelessly to fulfill. Yet even as Washington's successors preached assimilation, settlers enacted a more visceral doctrine. Beyond the Appalachian frontier, waves of squatters invaded native farmlands, torching crops and shooting livestock. The federal government, far from restraining these incursions, weaponized them. In 1790, Secretary of War Henry Knox authorized military retaliation against tribes resisting land cessions, a policy that transformed vigilante violence into state-sanctioned warfare. Cherokee towns in Tennessee vanished overnight, replaced by forts with names like Fort Marr and Fort Armistead, their timbers hewn from the same trees that once shaded tribal councils. The discovery of gold on Cherokee land in 1828 ignited a fever that laid bare the hypocrisy of civilization. Overnight, the Georgia legislature declared all Cherokee laws null and void, branding tribal leaders as foreigners in their homeland. In 1830, Georgia's General Assembly passed the notorious Indian Codes. Cherokee people could not testify in court against whites, own property, or assemble in groups larger than 3. Mining syndicates, backed by state militias, dynamited Cherokee orchards to reach gold-laden quartz. One eyewitness described whole mountainsides sliding into rivers, the waters running thick as cream with the blood of salmon choked by silt. These crimes found legal sanctity in the perverse alchemy of American jurisprudence. Chief Justice John Marshall, ruling on Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, deemed tribes domestic dependent nations, a phrase that reduced sovereign peoples to the status of wards, their rights evaporating like morning mist. Southern states seized on this ambiguity. Alabama invalidated Creek land titles, while Mississippi auctioned Choctaw homesteads at pennies an acre. Even native adoption of civilized practices proved futile. Cherokee planters, who owned enslaved Africans, wore waistcoats, and sent sons to Harvard, found their sophistication only deepened settlers' resentment. As one Georgia senator spat, "No Indian can be civilized, for civilization is the twin of whiteness." The trauma of this betrayal etched itself into native memory. At night, Cherokee mothers whispered warnings to children. The Onagas, whites, come first for your language, then your land, then your breath. In Creek villages, elders buried sacred pipes and copper plates, rather than let them fall to looters. Yet resistance pulsed underground. In 1811, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh surged through the South, rallying tribes to unite against land cessions. His words ignited the Red Stick War, a pan-tribal uprising that the U.S. crushed at Horseshoe Bend in 1814, a massacre overseen by Andrew Jackson, who celebrated by ordering Cherokee allies to slice noses from Creek corpses as trophies. By the 1820s, the civilizing mission had achieved its true aim: the reduction of native nations from sovereign peers to obstacles in America's manifest destiny. Georgia's goldfields became a microcosm of this national psychosis. Newspapers depicted Cherokee miners as thieves plucking diamonds from a crown, their ancestral claims erased by the alchemy of racism and greed. When Cherokee leaders presented their written constitution, modeled on the U.S. document to Congress, lawmakers sneered. Savages aping gentlemen, jeered Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen, prove only their talent for mimicry, not citizenship. In this crucible of hypocrisy, the stage was set for eradication. The civilization policy had not tamed the native spirit, it had exposed the lie of American benevolence. As gold-hungry mobs descended on Cherokee country, and missionaries penned false treaties, a truth became inescapable. The United States would never tolerate native success, only native surrender. What followed was not a clash of cultures, but a calculated dismantling of worlds, a betrayal etched in ink, in blood, and in the unmarked graves of children who perished far from home, their mouths still shaping forbidden words. Osceola, Halito, Chimo. Part 4. Andrew Jackson, the blood-stained architect. Andrew Jackson's hands were never clean. By the time he ascended to the presidency in 1829, they were already caked with the blood of thousands, a testament to his unrelenting crusade to purge native nations from lands he deemed destined for white civilization. His rise from backwoods brawler to America's 7th president was paved not with ideals, but with scalps, shattered treaties, and the screams of children. To understand the Trail of Tears, one must first grasp the psyche of the man who engineered it, a figure who transformed personal vendettas into national policy, and genocide into patriotic duty. The roots of Jackson's brutality took hold in 1814 at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Leading Tennessee militia and Cherokee allies against the Red Stick Creeks, a faction resisting American expansion, Jackson orchestrated a massacre that would foreshadow his presidency's ruthlessness. As the Creeks fortified themselves on a peninsula of the Tallapoosa River, Jackson ordered his forces to surround them, then unleashed a hellstorm of cannon fire and musket volleys. When the smoke cleared, nearly 800 Creek warriors lay dead, their bodies mutilated by troops under Jackson's command. Survivors recounted soldiers slicing strips of flesh from corpses to craft bridle reins for their horses, while Creek women and children who surrendered were sold into slavery. Jackson, reveling in the carnage, wrote to his wife, "The field is strewn with the dead. I weep, not for them." The Treaty of Fort Jackson that followed seized 23 million acres of Creek land, over half their territory, punishing even those Creeks who had fought alongside the Americans. For Jackson, this was no tragedy, but a triumph, the birth of his myth as an Indian fighter, and a blueprint for conquest. By 1828, Jackson's hatred of native sovereignty had hardened into doctrine. His electoral victory that year was fueled by frontier settlers demanding Cherokee removal, and he obliged with chilling zeal. In his first address to Congress, he declared Native nations savages who have neither the intelligence, the industry, nor the moral habits to coexist with whites. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, a legislative dagger aimed at all tribes east of the Mississippi, passed by a razor-thin margin after Jackson bullied Congress with threats and patronage. Opposition voices, including Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett, who called the act a stain on the nation's honor, were drowned out by the president's rhetoric of racial destiny. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages? Jackson sneered. To our extensive republic. The Cherokee became Jackson's prime target. Despite adopting a written constitution, a judicial system, and thriving farms, all hallmarks of the civilization policy, they stood in the way of Georgia's gold rush. Jackson's solution was a masterpiece of deception. In 1835, his agents courted Major Ridge, alias Boudinot, and a small faction of Cherokee elites later branded the Treaty Party to sign the New Akota Treaty. Negotiated in secret, without the consent of Principal Chief John Ross or the Cherokee National Council, the treaty ceded all ancestral lands for $5 million sand territory in Oklahoma. The vast majority of Cherokees, over 16,000 citizens, denounced it as treason. Boudinot's own sister reportedly threw the treaty document into a fire, shouting, "This paper bleeds." But Jackson, violating both U.S. law and the Cherokee Constitution, ratified it. When Supreme Court Justice John Marshall ruled in Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, that states had no authority over tribal lands, Jackson allegedly scoffed. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. The president's malice extended beyond politics. He personally ordered federal troops to escort surveyors onto Cherokee land, while encouraging mobs to terrorize indigenous families. Missionary Samuel Worcester, jailed for opposing Georgia's land grabs, described scenes where Cherokee mothers were whipped for speaking their language to children. Jackson's administration even weaponized starvation. The army withheld annuities owed to tribes until leaders voluntarily agreed to relocate. Yet Jackson's true legacy lies in the perverse legal framework he engineered. By framing removal as a benevolent exchange of land, he crafted a euphemism that sanitized ethnic cleansing. Congressional debates exposed the lie. Southern senators openly admitted removal was about securing slave plantation territories, while northern textile barons eyed Cherokee cotton fields. The president's allies circulated propaganda depicting Cherokee towns as dens of idleness, erasing their schools, printing presses, and thriving orchards. In private, Jackson's contempt for native life revealed itself. When Choctaw chief Pushmataha warned him removal would mean death for his people, Jackson reportedly laughed. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. His administration's mortality estimates for the forced marches were precise and callous. A tenth may perish, wrote Secretary of War Lewis Cass, but the remainder will prove useful in forming a buffer against Mexico. By 1838, Jackson had left office, but the machine of destruction he built roared on. The Treaty Party, now pariahs among their own people, faced assassinations. Major Ridge himself was gunned down in 1839 by Cherokee traditionalists. Jackson died in 1845, his coffin draped in a shroud woven from cotton harvested on stolen Muskogee land. Yet his true monument lay in the trails of graves, stretching westward, the shattered remains of nations, who understood too late that America's man of the people had always been their butcher-in-chief. Part 5. Concentration Camps and the Death March of Tears. In the sweltering summer of 1838, the Cherokee Nation's final act of resistance dissolved under the boots of 700 U.S. soldiers, militiamen, and mercenaries. General Winfield Scott, tasked with executing Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, issued a proclamation that echoed through the Appalachian valleys. Cherokees. The president has sent me to remove you. My troops already surround your country. You have no choice. What followed was not a military campaign, but a premeditated extermination, a operation so methodical in its cruelty that survivors would later call it Nuna Dal Suni, the trail where they cried. The invasion began at dawn. Soldiers stormed homesteads, battering down doors with rifle stocks. Families were dragged from their beds, children still clutching cornhusk dolls, elders clutching medicine bundles. A Georgia volunteer, Private John G. Burnett, later confessed women were jerked from their homes by soldiers whose language they could not understand. Children were separated from parents and driven into the stockades with blows and oaths. Cherokee cabins were looted for trinkets, their livestock slaughtered, their fields torched to ash. Sacred sites, ceremonial mounds, council houses, the printing press of the Cherokee Phoenix were vandalized with racial slurs. Soldiers amused themselves by setting fire to the tribe's bilingual library, its pages of Shakespeare and Sequoia curling into blackened leaves. Over 16,000 Cherokee, nearly the entire nation, were herded into makeshift concentration camps, euphemistically labeled emigration depots. At Fort Cass, Tennessee, thousands crouched in open-air pens, ankle-deep in mud and human waste. Summer storms turned the compound into a pestilential swamp. Dysentery and smallpox ravaged the incarcerated. Their weakened bodies fed rancid pork and moldy flour. In Camp Cherokee, Alabama, a Presbyterian missionary described infants sucking at breasts emptied by starvation, while cholera victims lay unburied for days, their limbs gnawed by feral dogs. A U.S. Army surgeon noted casually in his journal, 10 died last night. No coffins. Earth too hard for digging. The most haunting accounts emerged from Rattlesnake Springs, a camp where soldiers forbade the burial of the dead. A distraught mother, Ayoka, cradled her 3-year-old daughter's corpse for 3 days, singing lullabies to ward off scavengers. When soldiers finally pried the body away, Ayoka gouged her cheeks in mourning, leaving scars that would outlive her. Similar scenes unfolded across 31 camps. At gunpoint, Cherokee blacksmiths were forced to forge shackles for their own people, the clang of iron blending with the wails of those awaiting exile. By October, with autumn's first frost glazing the mountains, the deportation began. The Cherokee were divided into 13 groups, each assigned a conductor, who pocketed federal funds meant for food and blankets. The routes crisscrossing Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, and Arkansas were engineered for maximum suffering. Northern paths, traversed in winter, subjected refugees to blizzards in the frozen Ohio River Valley. Southern detours led through malarial swamps, where mosquitoes clouded the air. All converged on Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, a land already scarred by drought and the displaced peoples of other shattered tribes. The marches unfolded as rolling massacres. Soldiers prodded the starving with bayonets, forbidding stops to forage or hunt. Elderly men who faltered were abandoned. Pregnant women who collapsed went into labor on frozen ground, their newborns' first breaths misting in sub-zero air. Private Burnett recounted a night near the Mississippi River, where temperatures plunged to 22 F. I saw 7 corpses squatting in a circle, frozen mid-prayer. Nearby, a mother nursed a dead infant, hoping her warmth might wake it. Typhoid outbreaks turned wagons into mobile charnel houses, their wheels creaking under the weight of corpses stacked like cordwood. Opportunistic predators trailed the caravans. Slave traders kidnapped Cherokee girls as young as 12, selling them to brothels in Memphis and Little Rock. In Kentucky, whiskey peddlers swindled refugees out of heirloom silver in exchange for poisoned alcohol. Even the dead were not spared. Grave robbers pried gold teeth from skeletons and scalped skulls for souvenirs. The Cherokee, stripped of weapons by military decree, could only chant prayers to the spirits of the land. They killed the deer, the bear, our people, lamented Sali, an elder who later led a brief rebellion. But they could not kill the songs. The toll was apocalyptic. By March 1839, when the last stragglers limped into Oklahoma, an estimated 4,000 Cherokee, 1 in 4, had perished. Among them were Chief John Ross's wife, Kwati, who surrendered her blanket to a shivering child before dying of pneumonia, and Sequoia's son, Teasy, whose last act was burying a stolen Bible to save it from desecration. Survivors found a wasteland, no cabins, no crops, only meager rations left by a government that promptly forgot its promises. Yet within this abyss, glimmers of resistance flared. At the Illinois border, a group of Cherokee women staged a sit-in, refusing to cross the Mississippi until soldiers allowed a burial rite. In Tennessee, a healer named Agili distributed secret pouches of ginseng and sage to ward off disease, her chants defying the whip. And all along the trail, mothers covertly taught children the syllabary, inscribing characters in dirt with sticks. Their message was clear: they take our land, but not our words. The Trail of Tears was not an isolated tragedy, but a template. By 1840, 60,000 Native Americans from dozens of nations had been purged from their homelands. Yet the Cherokee's ordeal remains a grotesque pinnacle, a fusion of bureaucratic sadism and mob brutality that birthed America's first state-administered death march. Its legacy lives in the jagged rosters of the lost, names like Dahlonega, Corn Tassel, and Denali Black Fox, once borne by poets and statesmen, now etched only on wind-scattered stones. Part 6. Resistance and the Forgotten Warriors of Survival. Beneath the crimson shadow of American expansion, not all native nations bowed to the bayonet and the treaty's poisoned pen. While the Cherokee endured the Trail of Tears, others waged guerrilla wars of defiance, so ferocious they nearly cracked the young republic's myth of invincibility. These warriors, their names scrubbed from textbooks, their rebellions dismissed as skirmishes, forged legends in blood and swamp water, their resistance etching scars across the face of a nation that sought to erase them. In the tangled marshes of Florida, the Seminole Nation ignited what would become the costliest and longest war in U.S. Indian conflicts. The Second Seminole War, 1835, 1842. Here, under the leadership of the charismatic war chief, Osceola Yaholo, Black Drink Singer, a people redefined the art of resistance. Born to a Creek mother and a Scots-Irish trader, Osceola was a master of duality, fluent in English, yet a staunch traditionalist, a diplomat who skewered treaties with his knife. When U.S. agents demanded Seminoles surrender their lands under the 1832 Treaty of Payne's Landing, Osceola drove his blade into the parchment and hissed, "This is the only treaty I will sign." The Everglades became his ally, a liquid labyrinth of sawgrass and cypress, where Seminole warriors, alongside hundreds of free and escaped African Americans, known as Black Seminoles, vanished like ghosts. They struck in lightning raids, ambushing soldiers from submerged dugouts, their faces smeared with garfish oil to repel mosquitoes. Women planted fields of corn in hidden hammocks. Children learned to navigate by the cries of limpkin birds. The U.S. Army, clad in wool uniforms and hubris, found itself outmaneuvered in a war without front lines. General Thomas Jessup admitted, "This is not a war against men, but against the land itself." Osceola's defiance took a tragic turn in 1837, lured under a white flag of truce during peace talks near St. Augustine. He was shackled and imprisoned at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. There, as malaria devoured his body, he posed for a haunting portrait, a blanket draped defiantly over his shoulders, his gaze searing through the canvas. He died a prisoner in 1838, his final words reportedly mocking his captors. "Bury me with my boots on. I will march into the afterlife as a warrior." In a final indignity, army surgeons decapitated his corpse, displaying his skull in a museum as a trophy. Yet the Seminole fought on. Led by warriors like Wildcat Cohajo and the Black Seminole captain John Horse, they outlasted 3 U.S. presidents and $40 million in war debts. When the conflict sputtered to an uneasy end in 1842, over 3,000 soldiers and countless Seminoles lay dead. Those who remained in Florida became the unconquered people, ancestors of today's Seminole tribe, whose children still sing Osceola's war cries at tribal ceremonies. Far to the north, on the windswept bluffs of the Mississippi, another resistance flickered to life. Black Hawk Makatame Shekiaki, a Sauk warrior in his 60s, refused to accept the 1804 treaty that sold his tribe's ancestral lands in Illinois. "The earth is our mother," he declared. "How can we sell her?" In 1832, he led 1,500 Sauk, Meskwaki, and Kickapoo, including women and children, across the Mississippi to reclaim their cornfields. What followed was less a war than a massacre in motion. U.S. forces, aided by rival tribes and vigilantes, pursued Black Hawk's band in a grueling chase. At the Battle of Stillman's Run, 50 Sauk warriors routed 275 militia, sparking panic in white settlements. But hope crumbled at the Bad Axe River in Wisconsin, where Steamboat's Warrior and Enterprise cornered the starving group. Soldiers and Sioux allies fired cannons point-blank into families waiting across the river. One militiaman described squaws clutching papooses sinking under the water, their hands reaching up like reeds. Of Black Hawk's 500 followers, fewer than 150 survived, captured and paraded through eastern cities in a circus-like spectacle. Black Hawk dictated an autobiography, the first native-authored bestseller that ended with a prophecy. "A few more moons, and I shall be gone, but my words will stay." Today, his grave lies desecrated, his bones stolen by a museum curator. Yet his name resounds in native resistance movements, from Standing Rock to Mauna Kea. These rebellions shared a common thread: the fusion of tactical brilliance and spiritual fortitude. Seminole shamans blessed rifles with alligator fat. Sauk women smuggled seeds in their hair to replant sacred corn. Both nations turned America's tools against it. Osceola traded deerskins for European knives. Black Hawk studied militia tactics to outflank them. Most crucially, they rewrote the narrative of native savagery by sparing civilians, while U.S. troops slaughtered non-combatants. White historians dismissed these wars as futile, but the numbers defy erasure. The 4,000 Seminoles who evaded removal forced the United States to abandon its plan to erase them entirely. Black Hawk's autobiography exposed deportation's inhumanity, seeding abolitionist sentiment. Forgotten by mainstream memory, their legacies pulse in indigenous hip-hop lyrics, in the Seminole tribe's invincible alligator wrestling traditions, and in the annual Black Hawk Prayer Camp protests against oil pipelines. Theirs are not tales of defeat, but of sovereignty's unbroken thread, a reminder that not all trails ended in tears. Some vanished into swamps, where the water still whispers of warriors who refused to kneel. Part 7. Legacies and the Phoenix of Resilience. By 1840, the American Southeast lay hollowed out a wasteland of charred council houses and overgrown farmlands, where the bones of 25,000 native men, women, and children whispered warnings to the wind. Yet in the unlikeliest of places, a phoenix rose. Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, dubbed the Promised Land by federal liars, became a crucible of survival. Here, amidst rocky plains and scorpion-infested brush, the 5 civilized tribes, ravaged but unbroken, began stitching their worlds back together. Their story defies the myth of erasure. It is a testament to resilience written in the ink of loss, resistance, and the unyielding pulse of memory. The Cherokee, arriving last on the Trail of Tears, found a land already scarred by failed federal promises. The permanent territory granted by the Treaty of New Echota was a mirage, overcrowded, infertile, and stalked by Plains tribes resisting newcomers. Yet within weeks of their 1839 arrival, Cherokee women were turning soil with spoons to plant corn. Men erected log cabins, using techniques learned during their imprisonment at Fort Cass. By 1844, Tahlequah emerged as the new Cherokee capital, its sandstone council house mirroring the one lost in Georgia. The tribe reconstituted its government, courts, and bilingual school system. Sequoyah, though elderly and infirm, revived his printing press, producing almanacs and religious texts in syllabary each page, an act of defiance. The Choctaw and Chickasaw, displaced earlier, faced different trials. Oklahoma's arid climate mocked their agricultural prowess. Yet they adapted, breeding drought-resistant corn and trading with Comanche horse traders. In 1847, when Ireland's potato famine sparked mass starvation, the Choctaw Nation, still recovering from their own Trail of Tears, donated $170 over $5 today to Irish relief. Their act of solidarity, born of shared suffering, resonated across oceans. The Civil War, 1861-1865, tested these fragile recoveries. Though many Native leaders like Cherokee Chief John Ross advocated neutrality, the Confederacy courted tribes with promises of statehood and protection from federal removal. Desperate to secure their sovereignty, the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole signed treaties with the South. Over 20,000 Native men fought in the conflict, most notoriously the Cherokee Mounted Rifles, who participated in the massacre of Black Union soldiers at the Battle of Honey Springs. But loyalty, bought with bribes, proved fickle. When the Confederacy collapsed, the U.S. punished its Native allies by voiding treaties and seizing half of Oklahoma's land as reparations. Once again, survival meant adaptation. The Muscogee Creek Nation rebuilt its council fires atop railroad tracks, leasing right-of-way lands to fund schools. The 20th century brought new weapons of erasure. In 1907, Oklahoma became a state, its founding myth erasing Native history to frame the land as uninhabited. The Dawes Act dissolved communal territories, forcing Native citizens into individual allotments, a policy that stripped 90 million acres nationwide. Boarding schools like Oklahoma's Riverside Indian School resumed the assimilation crusade, punishing children for speaking ancestral languages. A survivor recalled nuns scrubbing her skin with lye soap, screaming, "We'll wash the Indian out of you." Modernity's assaults took subtler forms. The 2016 Dakota Access Pipeline protests revealed how sacred lands remained expendable. In Oklahoma, fracking operations now poison Cherokee cemeteries, while the Jones Academy, a former boarding school, houses oil drills beneath its basketball court. Native youth suicide rates, twice the national average, echo the trauma of ancestors who buried their dead on the trail. A 2020 study found Cherokee descendants of removal survivors exhibit epigenetic changes linked to chronic stress, proof that bodies remember what history obscures. Yet resilience flickers in these shadows. The Cherokee Nation, now 450,000 strong, runs immersion schools where toddlers converse in Salagi. In Okmulgee, Creek artists fuse traditional stomp dance rhythms with hip-hop, their beats punctuating protests against voter suppression. The Seminole tribe, once deemed extinct by textbooks, owns Hard Rock International, its global empire bankrolling language revitalization. And in 2019, Oklahoma's Supreme Court ruled that the Muscogee Nation's reservation was never dissolved, affirming tribal sovereignty in a landmark decision. The fight for remembrance continues. At the former Camp Cherokee site in Tennessee, archaeologists recently uncovered children's toys buried beneath military barracks, cornhusk dolls hidden by mothers facing deportation. Tribal historians are mapping every trail of Tear's death through oral testimonies, replacing anonymous grave counts with names like Osceola Fire and Golan Raven. Meanwhile, Native lawyers challenge pipelines using 19th-century treaties as legal shields, weaponizing the documents meant to destroy them. The story of the 5 tribes is not one of reconciliation, but reckoning. Their resurgence forces America to confront its founding paradox, a democracy built atop genocides. Yet it also offers a blueprint for survival. As Muskogee poet Joy Harjo writes, "We were never perfect, yet we find perfection in the struggle to keep singing." The trails may have ended in tears, but from those salted soils, nations learned to grow gardens. No storm can flatten. Part 8. Survival as the Phoenix Song of History. 2 centuries have passed since Andrew Jackson vowed that Native peoples would vanish into oblivion, their cultures extinguished beneath the boots of progress. But walk through Oklahoma today, and you'll hear the pound of powwow drums echoing across the plains, a heartbeat that refuses to be silenced. Teenagers in Cherokee Nation schools text each other in Sequoia's 85-character syllabary, resurrecting a script their ancestors hid from soldiers on the Trail of Tears. Seminole muralists in Miami spray paint sprawling graffiti portraits of Osceola and Black Seminole rebels, their art adorning concrete walls where condos once threatened sacred burial grounds. The story of Native America is no elegy. It is a roaring anthem of resilience, a living rebuke to those who mistook survival for surrender. Consider Tahlequah, Oklahoma, where Cherokee linguists have transformed smartphones into weapons of cultural revival. An app called Salagi now teaches toddlers to count in Cherokee, using animations of box turtles and river cane. At Sequoia High School, students debate climate policy in both English and Cherokee, their voices layering over holographic projections of the original Cherokee Phoenix newspapers. In 2022, the Cherokee Nation gifted a sapling from its ancestral white oak forests, a species nearly eradicated by colonial logging, to the descendants of Irish famine survivors, repaying a 175-year-old debt of solidarity. The tree now grows in County Cork, its roots mirroring the tangled bonds of those who outlived erasure. To the south, the Seminole tribe of Florida has turned survival into grand paradox. Their Hard Rock Cafe empire, a global chain born of 20th-century desperation, now funds language nests where elders teach Miccosukee to preschoolers. In the Everglades, airboat captains narrate Osceola's guerrilla tactics to tourists, their boats skimming over waters where Seminole ancestors once ambushed U.S. troops. Meanwhile, street artists like Hoxie V of the Brightline Murals Collective reclaim Miami's gentrified neighborhoods, with neon-hued visions of the green corn dance, blending ancestral symbols with Afrofuturist skies. "We paint the past alive," Hoxie says, "so the future remembers its bones." The struggle is far from ceremonial. At Standing Rock, Cheyenne River Sioux water protectors faced down attack dogs and freezing winters in 2016. Their resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, reigniting a centuries-old fight for sovereignty. In Oklahoma, Muskogee Creek attorneys invoked the 1832 Treaty of Washington to halt a gas pipeline threatening the Arkansas River, a legal gambit that forced a federal judge to acknowledge, for the first time, that treaties are not relics, but living promises. Even the land itself rebels. Along the Trail of Tears route in Tennessee, archaeologists recently discovered sacred Cherokee herbs, like socan and liastre, popping through cracks in Walmart parking lots, their seeds dormant since the 1830s. Perhaps no one encapsulates this defiant continuity better than Joy Harjo, the Muskogee poet and first Native U.S. poet laureate. In her poem, An American Sunrise, she writes of ancestors still throwing sparks, their songs stitching the heavens to the earth. Harjo's work, like the Seminoles' guerrilla art or the Cherokee's digital syllabary, insists that survival is not passive. It is an act of war against forgetting. Her verses, recited at protests and presidential inaugurations alike, refuse the binaries of victimhood. They tried to bury us, she reminds audiences. They didn't know we were thunder. The lesson of the Trail of Tears is not one of indigenous vulnerability, but of empire's fatal blindness. Andrew Jackson's America presumed that shattered families and burned villages would sever a people from their past. It failed to foresee how memory would migrate into songs, how stories would seep into soil, how the act of breathing itself could become resistance. Today, Native nations leverage drone technology to patrol reservation borders, sue multinational corporations for treaty violations, and stream stomp dances on TikTok to 500,000 followers. The Muskogee Creek poet, Akosia Redbird, terms this survivance 2.0, a fusion of tradition and innovation that transforms trauma into generative rage. History, it turns out, does not belong to the conquerors. It belongs to the Oklahoma grandmothers, teaching cradleboard weaving on YouTube, to the Navajo coders programming AI in Dine Bizad, to the Puyallup fishermen rebuilding salmon runs with blockchain-tracked seeds. It belongs to the Seminole hip-hop artist who samples powwow drums over trap beats, and the Cherokee botanist crossbreeding ancient corn strains to outlast climate change. Most of all, it belongs to the children, like 12-year-old Aliyah Jumper, who testified before Congress in 2023 wearing beaded sneakers and her great-great-grandmother's turtle shell necklace, demanding climate justice in fluent Seminole. As the sun sets over Red Clay, Tennessee, where the Cherokee Nation Council last met before deportation, the wind carries more than ghosts. It bears the laughter of Cherokee immersion students on a field trip, their hands sticky from wild strawberry juice. A park ranger points to the council house's reconstruction, an act of defiance funded by casino revenues, and recounts how Choctaw scouts once mapped stars here for planting seasons. Nearby, a granite plaque commemorates the Trail of Tears. Someone has left a spray of tobacco ties and a hand-scrawled note. You tried to kill US. We made more life. 200 years after Andrew Jackson declared native annihilation inevitable, the people he sought to erase have drafted a rebuttal not in ink, but in the electric buzz of neon art, the coding of language apps, the rhythm of corn shucking in communal gardens. The Trail of Tears is not merely a scar of the past, but a warning. Cultures forged in resistance cannot be destroyed. They adapt. They remember. They rise. As Joy Harjo tells her audiences, closing every reading with the same vow, we are still here. After everything, because of everything we are still here. The drums keep beating.